Exactly. It was the end of this block, so I was really trying to squeeze it in, and today it's rainy and crappy out, so this is a great. I appreciate you doing it on a Saturday.
Yeah, for sure, man. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on here.
Yeah, so we're pretty like cycling based. You
Yeah.
probably saw or heard from I was talking to Ashton, who I got in touch with through another guy who he raced on the track with Ashton, and I did some road stuff with him. And
Okay.
my background, I think I might have mentioned in an email, of strength training was I started with a cycling coach about 9 or 10 years ago, and the strength
Mhm.
training was couple months, you do it in the off season,
Right,
biking
right.
starts, see you later. And it wasn't
Sure.
until I'm going to be 39 in a month. And it wasn't until I got to be about 35 years old that I was like, man, I thought I was having some like bike fit issues or something. And my friend was like, dude, you're getting older. Like, you need to really start thinking of other things off the bike. And so I've only been super pro lifting all year round. When I say pro, meaning like very for it, for probably two
Sure.
years. And the
Okay.
gains that I've seen from that on the bike, I tell all my athletes that are 35 or older, I'm like, this is a must. But even younger guys, I'm
Yes.
like, dude, lift. And everyone comes out in spring feeling amazing because they're so
Absolutely.
strong. And then we forget about it. Um,
Right.
that's kind of where I'm at. I'm sure you hear that time and time and time again. Um,
I do.
yeah.
I do.
I was looking on your website. I love it. I don't like to really intro people. You tell the people you're Chris
Okay. Sure.
Dellasega, and who are you?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I've been kind of around weights for a long time. I mean, there's about a 12-year gap between my uncle and my dad. And so, when I was kind of, growing up, there was, kind of weights always around. He always had like a little workout area on the patio. He played sports, all through high school and that sort of thing. And then just kind of evolved from there. I mean, it was, our PE teacher in middle school had a weight room that was about 3 or 4 or 5 blocks away from our middle school. So Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays after school, we'd pile into his Forerunner. He'd blare Bob Dylan, all the way down 4 or 5 blocks down to the gym. We'd lift. And I kind of fell out of it a little bit during high school, but then started getting back into it after high school. Started actually just trying to kind of get in shape for the Marine Corps basic training. I never went in, but that kind of kind of blossomed from there. And so I was working as a graphics manager for a number of years, and pursued a degree in my bachelor's is actually in commercial graphics or in technology. But worked for a number of years in that profession and decided I wasn't really happy with that. I'd been bodybuilding for a number of years by that point, and then decided to start looking into schools that had exercise science programs. And so uh, University of Kansas has got a good exercise science program. Enrolled there, and graduated with my master's in exercise physiology in 2011. In that, kind of between that time, I've worked with guys that have played in the NFL, guys that have gone on to play in the NBA. My most recent guy got picked up by the Boston Red Sox organization, so he's playing for one of their affiliates, and a number of athletes, kind of from a lot of different sports. Obviously, Ashton worked as a strength coach for the men's endurance national team for a while. That was kind of COVID hit, and then that kind of put the brakes on everything because it hit just as the road season was really starting to pick up.
Mhm.
And so we're still kind of in limbo as far as that goes. But now I own and operate an athletic strength institute in the town where I live, Lawrence, Kansas. And that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of it. So, I mean, I've been doing this for quite some time. And the interesting thing that a lot of people sometimes don't are kind of surprised by is that I have absolutely zero background in competitive cycling. Just as I've got zero background in PGA level golf or NBA
Right.
level basketball or baseball.
Mhm.
Um, but kind of what I do have, I suppose, that kind of separates me from other coaches is I don't view like I don't train the sport. I don't train the position that
Yeah.
someone plays in that sport. I train the individual. Because what I've seen is, you may have two athletes that play the same position in the same sport, but when you start to look at them as far as how their biomechanics work or what strength discrepancies that they have, they may need two totally different kinds of training. And then you factor in other, other things on that, on top of that, as well, like, yeah, what is their particular event? What are the most common injuries in said event or sport or position? And that's kind of makes up my, my philosophy of training.
So everyone, if you want to check out the website, it's is it athleticsi.com?
Yes,
Yeah.
athleticsi.com.
So I encourage people to check out his website, follow him on Instagram. And I don't want to steal the thunder, but you're kind of alluding to, under your philosophy page, the Kaizen. Is that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell people what
So,
Kaizen is. I absolutely loved when I read that on your page.
all right, sure. So the interesting thing about is, at least this is how I have come to learn about it and understand it. It's actually a Japanese business philosophy that was taught by Americans as we helped them rebuild their economy after World War II. And so really what Kaizen means is constant, continuous progress. But that progress is frequently made in very small increments. And so, if say you've got a factory of workers, 100 workers, and if every worker in that factory tries to be, 1% better than they were last week, last quarter, last month, whatever, then that obviously adds up and builds up over time. And so now you've got 100 employees multiplied by 1% of performance improvement multiplied by 52 weeks out of the year. That adds up at the end of the year to a huge improvement. And so, when you apply it to strength training or any kind of athletic training, to be honest, that's really kind of what it means, is that, you're not going to go in and set personal bests every year, or every workout, I should say. But the goal is to, try to improve your previous performance in some way, shape, or form. And those little improvements add up big time,
Big time.
over a period. Yeah,
It is massive. It's actually, as we've utilized social media and kind of grown our business and had people find us that don't know us as bike racers, and a question that I would get is like, hey, what's your training methodology? Which I really like. And so I've been working through this and putting up, like, what are our pillars? What do we really believe in? And one of the number one thing is consistency. And
sure.
within the cycling realm, since you aren't a cyclist, there's been this trend in the past, I want to say, I've noticed a lot more in the past maybe 4 to 5 years, of athletes that, there's some good online programs and I love them and I'm not knocking them, but it's a very like, here's the quick fast track. And I'm
Right.
like, this is endurance sports. Like, there is no fast track. And it is
No.
this consistent year over year over year thing. So I had an athlete one time, we'd worked together maybe 7 or 8 months, and he messaged me about how he wanted to win a race that I wanted. He wanted to win a race how I wanted, but also wanted to get the same result. And I said politely to him, I said, hey man, this is somewhat of a backhanded insult to me, because I've ridden 120,000 miles and you've trained for
Right.
7 months. Like,
Sure.
my first 7 months, it's a joke where you go, like, this is a journey, and it's all these micro wins that you get time over time over time, and they add on each other. And it's like, Ashton made the comment, one thing that he's really picked up in his learning how to coach athletes is understanding time and zone. So
Yeah.
if you have 60 minutes to go get, the time and zone, after 40 minutes, if you need a break, take a quick 5-minute break, finish the last 20 minutes. And I just this morning had a guy who was like, he had 2 by 30 minutes. And he said, hey man, I really wanted to impress you. I wanted to give it all one whack in 60 minutes, but I could only get to 50. And I said, I like that you're thinking of removing the rest interval, but also look at
Yeah.
it as you just cut off 12.5% of the work. So
Oh, for
while
sure.
that effort's great, there's, get that little win, then the next day and the next.
Yes.
So to see that on your site, I love that. And yeah, it was really, really cool. What's
Yeah. I mean, actually, just to kind of follow up with one
Sure.
thing right there, there's actually a book I'm reading right now called Win, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing, written by a guy named Daniel Pink. And I listened to an interview with him on NPR, and that's actually what made me want to read the book. And in that interview on NPR, he said something that has really, really stuck with me, and it really bears worth repeating. And it really goes that, taking breaks is a necessary part of productivity. It is absolutely not a deviation from it. And so sometimes I think that is kind of like what you're alluding to there, is that, sometimes people want to not take breaks when their body's kind of, telling them, yeah, you probably should take a break right now. Because at the end of the day, it usually, if you structure it right and apply it right, means, kind of what we're talking about. You'll end up better on the other side,
Mhm.
having taken that break than not. I mean, because at the end of the day, the magic is the fact that there is no magic. It's just showing up and doing what you need to do daily in order to get to where
Y-
you want to go.
Man, you're speaking like you are a seasoned cyclist, because there's always like, what's the magic interval? And there's a guy that a big program that a lot of us use is called WKO. And one of the Tim Cusick, he's a big thought leader. He really coaches more pros and everything. And he had a webinar where he's like, so this is the part that no one's going to want to hear. There's no secret intervals. And the thing about
Sure.
pros is they're really good at doing the boring work. And
Oh,
we're in an endurance sport where like a lot of it is just go ride at 75% of your max, 65% of your max. And then when you go hard, you're going to go full tilt, super hard. But everybody kind of wants to go kind of hard so that they go home and they
yeah.
feel like they worked out. And I'm like, that's
Uh,
unfortunately, that's not our sport. Like, it's not just kilojoules every day. It's not, you're not on the Stairmaster, like trying to lose weight. You're trying to get
sure.
faster and have your body adapt to this stimulus. So, what was
Yeah.
the name of the book? It's Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing.
Correct.
And the author was
Uh,
Daniel
Pink is in the
Pink.
color, Pink.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
cool. I'm going to look up his NPR interview also. And that's awesome. You had mentioned on your site also, one of like the first bullet points was talking about nutritional advice for athletes, saying, hey,
Yes.
you might be thinking that you're eating right, but you're probably missing something. What are
Right.
some top things that you see from just athletes in general? And then maybe is there a difference when you see endurance athletes coming to you, like cyclists, triathletes, runners?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the four biggest things that we see kind of across the board, regardless of whether it's a strength and power athlete or an endurance athlete, is typically not enough quality protein. They are sometimes frequently chronically dehydrated, or at least mildly dehydrated. Usually don't get enough fruits and vegetables to the degree or to the amount that they need, and usually not enough healthy fats. And that is kind of a big deal because, especially with endurance sports, it's an interesting thing because, it's not about calories in versus calories out. And that sometimes is too much of people's philosophy when it comes to training, or nutrition rather, especially with endurance athletes. And so what I mean by that is 1,000 calories of jelly beans and Skittles is going to be completely different than 1,000 calories of lean proteins and healthy greens and maybe some fruits. And so, that's one of the things is that you can't out train a bad diet. And so it's usually going to be a matter of getting enough of the necessary nutrients and the appropriate amounts to support the level of activity that someone's competing at. And one of the things too that I see a lot is just really, and I don't say this lightly, but just really poor food choices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the things that I have been fortunate to do is work with a group called the Poliquin Group, named after legendary strength coach named Charles Poliquin. And so when I worked for that company, we had one of the doctors that we kind of did some additional work with, who was kind of a consultant with us, I guess, is a guy named Jim Laval. And Jim is trained as his background, at least as I understand it, is in pharmacology. So he's a pharmacist by training. But he and his one of his business partners were actually brought on to become Corvette Formula One's medical team, if you will. And so one of the things that they started to identify was the fact that all of these different racing teams were putting tons of money into their cars, but they weren't spending any money almost whatsoever on the health and the quality of health of their drivers. And so that's kind of an important deal, because if you've got a car that's worth several $1,000,000, but yet you're not investing that same kind of attention into your drivers, well, that's kind of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things that they do, to be honest with you, in an ideal situation, if somebody was to give to me, control, if you will, over a team's nutrition supplementation, and performance training, one of the first things that I would do is have them run a food intolerance test. What foods are you tolerant to versus what foods are you intolerant to? Because one of the things that you frequently see with endurance athletes is the fact that they have some sort of low-grade chronic inflammation.
Mhm.
Now, that sometimes is going to be made worse if you're consistently eating foods that you are sensitive to. Now, these are not, full-blown food allergies, because most of the time, people that are going to be our age or, a bit older are going to already know, if they're allergic to certain foods, which is completely different than food sensitivities. And so when you have chronic foods that, when you're eating chronic food, or, hi, buddy.
That's just beyond the full one.
Okay. Thank you. I'm busy right now. Sorry.
That's all right.
But yeah, so if you're eating foods that you're chronically, sensitive to, on top of the amount of volume of training that someone does, then you run that risk of even having more, inflammation, systemic inflammation, that you would have if they were eating a diet of foods that they weren't, intolerant to. So I think that's a huge thing, and I think that's something that more sports programs are actually catching on to, because I know of a strength coach who's got control over those kinds of aspects of their performance team, and that's one of the things that they've done. And for example, head coach had just allergies, just bad allergies, and had to give himself shots or get shots, allergy shots, like once a week or a couple times a week. As soon as they run that food allergy test, though, they found all of the foods that he was sensitive to and removed them, from his diet. And then all of a sudden, his need for those allergy shots and those just kind of that just the things that you frequently see with people who have allergies just kind of just started to dissipate, kind of on their own.
Mhm.
And so I think it's a huge thing, and that's something that I think is not necessarily always given the amount of attention that it needs to be given.
Where would you recommend people go get a food intolerance test done? Or is that something that they can do? Is it just like a primary care or a specific facility? Or what's the best place to get a reliable one done? Because I actually think
Sure.
I
So
should do that. I've thought before that I might have gluten sensitivity. And I can't tell if I train probably more than I should. And
uh,
there's times where I'm like, I feel kind of puffy. I know it's not fat, and since I'm a big dude, like my water weight can be
sure,
very high or low. And
sure.
I'm like, I really think like I'm probably eating something that is just not the best thing for me. Um,
Right.
where
And
would
that's
one
common.
do that?
I mean, that's so, you can, primary care physicians typically will not be, I mean, they're not necessarily always receptive to kind of new forms, new things. As the saying goes, don't be the first to use a new modality, but don't be the last person either. And
Mhm.
so some aren't necessarily always the most willing to give it the credence that I think that it's due. So most of the time you'll have really good luck with naturopaths, somebody who does a little bit more functional medicine, things like that. I'm trying to think of the sensitivity test that seems to be the most popular within my coaching circle, but I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head. I'd be more than happy to look it up and get
Sure,
it over
yeah.
to you,
Shoot
though.
me an email. I'll put it in the notes so if people want to look it up. Um,
Sure.
Another question I had. So Johnny Cyclist is listening to this right now, and he's like, all right, so the four things I'm missing is everything. Quality protein. I'm dehydrated, so I need to drink more water. I need to eat more fruits and veggies, and I need to change up my healthy fats. What's an
Sure.
action item that you think somebody can, say, we all know you got to clean up the diet. Don't go to McDonald's. Don't eat Cheetos.
Right.
Leave the candy and cake alone. For the
Right.
athlete that is already, they're past those beginner moves, they're trying to like optimize everything. Maybe even a guy like Ashton, super high level athlete. And I don't use him as an example, but that type of athlete where you come and you're like, hey man, you're still doing this. You're still not eating enough of this. Is it
Yeah.
just eat more good protein, look for more good fats, and then what should we be taking out? Are we eating maybe too many carbs, maybe too much bread? Is there a trend that you see, or what should athletes look
Yeah.
for maybe when they say, hey, all right, this is what I'm eating. How do I shift
Yeah.
these numbers around?
Right, right, right. So there's actually, the first thing that I usually look for is actually protein, because if you break down the word protein, it is of Greek origin, but it actually means of primary importance, or primary, right? So I mean, that goes to show just how actually important it really is. Now, that's the first thing that I usually look at. And so there's new research out from Brad Schoenfeld that looks at how much protein is kind of necessary, like per meal, and like what the research is kind of showing as far as what supports, anabolism. And so, and it's kind of, been in bodybuilding circles for quite some time, but it's usually depending on the level of activity of someone, anywhere from 1 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, per day. So that's usually a lot of protein.
Mhm.
With endurance athletes, though, it's an interesting thing because, certain sports will kind of self-select. And so you don't typically have guys that look like NFL defensive linemen being endurance runners or endurance cyclists. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
typically, someone's particular body type will kind of, pre-select what sports they're automatically drawn to. So endurance athletes are typically more of an ectomorphic kind of body type, right? They're very, very long. They're very lean. They kind of walk around at a naturally low body fat. So that being said, though, on top of being endurance athletes, many times they want to prioritize carbohydrates. And so you had mentioned bread in there. And so, if it's somebody who has, a gluten sensitivity, then obviously I'd be a little bit more concerned as to what kind of bread, that they're eating and things like that. So I would definitely look at the protein first, but then the secondary thing that I would look at is what are the carb sources? Because what I've seen is a lot of processed carbohydrates. And that actually can add to the overall systemic inflammation. And
Mhm.
so I mean, there would be times where we'd show up at the velodrome and they'd have a snack table kind of laid out between sets, and it'd be full of gummy bears and Swedish fish and stuff
Granola.
like that, granola. And
I know
actually the
I
granola is going to be the healthiest option out of those three there that I just listed off.
we cannot go into my cupboard right now because I definitely eat too many granola bars. And
Sure.
I do have the family size Swedish fish for like long bike rides. But it's sad. I mean, I
Right,
have to put a sticker on it that says for rides only. Otherwise, once
right,
I'm tired and it's 7 p.m. and I'm like, ooh, I want something sweet. I'm like, well, a handful's not going to kill
yeah,
me. And I have a poor
yeah,
justification. I stopped drinking alcohol. So I'm like, well, I'm not drinking. I can eat this candy. And it's like, okay,
right.
you don't need to like trade vices here. Um,
Sure. That's actually kind of an interesting point. Because one of the things that you will frequently see, for example, is with endurance athletes, is that they typically have higher than normal, if you will, resting cortisol levels. And so the interesting thing about cortisol is the fact that it is, it's catabolic, right? But the thing with that, though, is the fact that insulin and cortisol cannot be in the bloodstream at the same time to any magnitude because they do exact opposites. You know what I'm saying? And so when your body's kind of used to that high cortisol level, it's actually found a workaround. And that workaround is, well, if I sense, my body senses, if you will, and this is usually not something that you have actual cognitive thoughts about, it's something that kind of happens subconsciously, if you will. If you have consistently high cortisol levels, your body actually knows that a good workaround, eat something sugary. Because if you eat
mm,
something sugary, if you eat something, it's going to spike your insulin. Well, what does insulin do? Well, insulin drives down your cortisol levels. And so with endurance athletes, that's one of the things that we frequently see is that it's funny because when I was still working as a strength coach and had a lot of national team guys, it was always interesting to me because I'd always get like a flood of text messages and emails, things like that, like later into the evening. And so one of the things that we will kind of sometimes see is that you'll have that kind of mid-afternoon little slump, but then a little bit of a rebound in the evening. And that's usually when I would get those text messages and emails, is because they're still kind of amped up from the day's workouts and stuff like that.
That's interesting. And so you're actually getting above my head. And so I definitely know above some of the people that will be watching this. So cortisol is released from the stress from the workout, correct?
Yeah, so cortisol, anytime your body perceives a threat or anything like that, your body will actually start to then produce what we call a cortisol dump. And so it dumps a bunch of cortisol. So it's essentially just fight or flight response. And so as soon as
Okay.
your body identifies the fact that there's a fight or flight, it mobilizes all the physiological systems necessary to either meet or beat that threat. And one of the things that it does is, you perceive the threat, you're just like, oh no, I've either got to fight this thing or get away from it. Dumps a bunch of cortisol in your system. Cortisol then releases a whole bunch of glucose, which is good if you're in a workout or trying to escape a threat. And then, yeah, you either basically one or the other. And when you have a hard time shutting that off, your body's got other ways that it will kind of help to shut it off for you, if you will. One of those ways is, and we see it a lot with like folks who have sometimes a bit of a binge eating problem later in the evening. That's one
Mhm.
of the things that we frequently is they typically don't eat enough food throughout the earlier part of the day. And then they
Mhm.
come home, and you kind of calm down, it's comfortable surroundings, and you're like, "Mm, I'm hungry now. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's eat."
One of the
Yeah.
best things a guy told me when I first started riding, he said, eat like a king at breakfast, a prince at lunch, and a pauper at dinner. And he said, when I say a pauper, I don't mean no food and starve yourself. I mean high nutrient, low cal. You're going to bed. You don't need to
Yes.
be, and some people think like, I'm not going to eat breakfast. I'm going to have this little lunch. I'm being good today. And then they're like, uh-oh. And you can't, I think we've all been there, but like at least for myself, when I've gotten not knowing what I was doing with food, you get there and you're like, I just can't stop eating. Like your brain takes over, and
Yep.
it's just like, see ya. And there's actually an
Sure.
interesting thing that I think it was Phil Guyman's coach. I don't know if you know the name, big former pro cyclist. He was talking about, and I can't remember who his coach's name was. He's huge on him eating like a big steak because it's recovery time, going
Yeah.
to bed. He doesn't need carbs. He's not going to run a marathon in his sleep. He's recovering. So, do you recommend,
Sure.
obviously, if you're talking about 1 to 2 grams per kg of body weight, for me, that's about 160 grams of protein. I'm going to be needing to eat
Right.
it throughout the day. Is there a time that an athlete should try to focus on this? And do you skew that one way or the other based on it's a rest day? Or I feel more carnivorous after I've lifted, and I don't know if that's BS or if that's actually my body like, yo, dude, eat some protein and
Yeah.
get it in there.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, so I think that's definitely, part of it for sure is, get some food in there, right after that workout, because the first thing that you eat is typically kind of what's going to be shuttled to your muscles, after essentially a workout where you're, not, you know, hopefully haven't had too big of a meal too soon to your workout. So your body's kind of running on empty, as it were. Um, but one of the things I would suggest as far as like how to kind of divvy it up throughout the day, if you will, is definitely eat a good, eat a breakfast that's rich in protein. I'm not saying not to have carbs with breakfast, but definitely have, a good protein, a quality protein. As a matter of fact, like if like steak and eggs is like no joke, like the breakfast of champions. I'm typically a big fan of red meat in the morning. And that's largely because red meat's got more it's got a higher concentration of tyrosine in it. And tyrosine is an amino acid that is the metabolic precursor to dopamine. So dopamine's, it's a catecholamine, but it's also that neurotransmitter that's like, all right, let's get stuff done. So it's kind of like, after you have that first half of your first cup of coffee in the morning, you're charged up and ready to go. Yes, it's the caffeine, but caffeine also kind of elicits a little bit of a dopamine response on top of that. And so there's a lot of research to kind of back that up too, in that, most research that has looked at, high protein versus high carbohydrate breakfasts have actually shown that students will perform both physically perform better both physically and cognitively after having a rich protein breakfast versus a high carbohydrate breakfast. As far as kind of when to divvy it up after that throughout the day, I would definitely suggest having a good protein rich meal immediately following training or within the first hour, 2 hours after training, something like that. And then into the evening, it's kind of an interesting thing because one of the things that you will frequently see too with endurance athletes, and this is just endurance athletes in general, is sometimes more often than not, they don't sleep very well, or their quality of sleep is not very good, or they don't sleep long enough. And so one of the things that I do and suggest is when that's present is to actually have carbohydrates with their dinner. Because your body can actually synthesize and release cortisol even when you're asleep. And so by having, some carbohydrates later in the evening, like with your dinner, like a sweet potato, something like this, brown rice, steel cut oats, something along those lines, brown rice, wild rice, it actually helps to blunt the cortisol response a little bit. And so that actually puts you in a little bit of a better position to actually then start winding down for sleep.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that I've had an issue with, and why I wouldn't necessarily do the Phil Guyman's coach thing is like I've had the bedtime bonking where I wake up at 2 o'clock and I don't know that I'm out of fuel, but like I'm up and I'm not going back to sleep. And there was
Right.
a couple times that, one for a religious reason and the other time just I like to change things up, went vegan one time for about 4 months and the other time just for a couple. And
Mhm.
I think it was more because of not getting enough calories, because there's some weeks where I'm burning like 25,000, and it's really harder for me to do that if I'm doing a vegan diet. But my sleep
Yeah.
got really messed up, and I was sleeping like maybe 6 hours, which is not normal. I'm usually 8 to 9, and I was
Right.
waking up at very weird hours, wide awake, like ready to go. So I was getting up, and I was like, I had a couple athletes who are like, dude, why are you responding to my files at 3 in the morning? I'm like, I'm just up. And I still don't know what that was. I think it was just not enough food, but I mean, I was eating a
Yeah.
solid amount. And yeah. So anyways, it's interesting. Just, man, there's a lot of thoughts from that. One thing that you had said, so if an athlete though has a really high intense session that day, are you
Mhm.
not recommending they eat carbs before that, and they're relying on the carbs from the day before and their glycogen? Or if somebody has like a 4 or 5 hour ride, is that an
Mhm.
asterisk to the steak and eggs?
Well, like I said, I would definitely do steak and eggs, but if you feel, that you need those additional carbohydrates, then yeah, I would certainly add some in for sure. But
Mhm.
I would add them in forms of more of a starchy carbohydrate, not necessarily something that's more sugary or easier to break down, as it were, because you want something that's going to sustain you for a longer period of time. So
Mhm.
sugars, yeah, they give you a short burst of energy, but then they tank, right?
Mhm.
But something that's more starchy, it may not get as high, but you're gonna be able to ride it out for longer, And so at my gym, I sometimes use use that analogy, but use like starchy carbohydrates as like your kindling, like wood, and
Yeah.
use your fruits, sugaries like kerosene, right? So you
Yes.
put this, pile of sticks, pile of kerosene. Well, one's going to burn hotter and faster, but quicker. One's going to burn slower, but longer.
I'm all about variety in almost everything in life, and especially for like training stimulus, but also food reactivity, I'll call it, when I tell people to carb load. So I don't know, you might not be a carb load guy. Do you believe in carb loading?
In the right circumstances, yeah.
Okay.
Because I mean, that just the caveat. It depends on who you're working with. So yes,
Sure,
if it
sure,
works, it
sure. Yeah,
works.
yeah. And so I was talking to a guy, and I forget what he was eating, but it was like he went full tilt on one thing, and I was like, okay, that's my bad on not explaining this more. I'll go. The way I kind of break it down in my head is like potatoes, sweet potatoes, like a starchy carb, but then also have, if you go out, you're driving to this race, maybe your only option for dinner is going to be pasta, like plain pasta and sauce or something like that. And then before you go to bed, maybe some oatmeal. And then if you have like a sweet tooth and you're not super full, eat a little bit of candy or like some fruit, but like have these different types of carb sources. And similar
Yes.
in the morning, I've been to so many races where I see a guy eating like an avocado toast and like eggs, but no carbs. And I'm like, dude, you're going to go try and ride really hard for 4.5 hours. Let me know how you feel 2.5 hours in. And,
Right.
you know, Patrick, the guy that I coach with, one of the guys I coach with, we're very like pro carb, and it works for some people, for a lot of people, but
Yeah.
I've had athletes that are high performers that are like, I don't feel good. I'm like, then it's not for you. Like,
Right.
everybody's different. You gotta,
Right.
I think that's when it comes to testing out things. You've got a long ride on the weekend. That's not a competition. Try something then. That's really
Sure.
interesting. I will consider the steak and eggs thing.
Yeah.
I'm probably in the protein deficient group a little bit. Um,
Sure.
I don't know. I used to try. I had used my fitness pal before just to get a sense of like portion sizes and macronutrients. I think it's really interesting though. We never talk about micronutrients, and you clearly, just from the way you talk, know the benefit of when you said like Skittles versus fruits and veggies.
Right.
I think so many athletes are missing the boat on that, and that's really those non-tangible things that are going to help you recover and come back to the next session to train harder and better, which goes back to what we first talked about building every 1% over time.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
what's supplements for lifting or
Yeah.
sports? You into those at all?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, like that's something that I actually used to help teach when I worked in Rhode Island, is how supplements can be beneficial and how they can uh, it's somewhat dependent on who you're working with and what the goal is. But by and large, there's been no shortages of examples where it's like, okay, well, what supplements are you taking right now? And most of the supplements someone will be taking are more performance based. So then my follow-up question is, are you taking a multivitamin? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, you don't have any business then messing around with performance supplements if you're not even meeting the basic criteria or meeting the basic minimum kind of requirements of what your nutrients are. And so it's been written about, repeatedly that, high performing athletes many times lose nutrients at an expedited rate over general population because you lose so many nutrients just through sweat. And then that's compounded obviously by the number of training sessions that you may have per day or per week, per month, what have you. And so, I've got certain supplement protocols that I will use with different athletes depending on what we're trying to achieve. But kind of the foundation supplement protocol almost always starts with a probiotic, a multivitamin. And then from there, it's a fish oil and magnesium, vitamin D3, especially with the months that we're in now, and a probiotic. Those are kind of like the foundation supplements, because those are the kind of supplements or the nutrients that we should be getting every day through our just basic nutrition. But because of current agricultural practices, that sort of thing, we typically don't get it. For example, when I was a grad student, I did a lot of research on magnesium, and magnesium is a super important nutrient. And it is estimated by 2009, the Food and Drug Administration released a chart that looked at RDAs, recommended daily allowances. And something like 68% of the North American population doesn't even get the minimum the minimum level of magnesium necessary. Mm-hmm. Magnesium does like 300 different things within the body. Yeah. Now, for performance athletes, that's super important because everyone's familiar with ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. We used to refer to it as cellular currency, right, in school. Well, here's the deal. In order for ATP to be bioavailable, so in order for it to be in a form that your body can actually use, it has to be carried through the bloodstream or carried through the body with a magnesium ion. And if you've got 68% of the American population that's not even meeting the recommended daily allowance, it's important to note that the recommended daily allowances were established in the 1940s as we prepared to mobilize for World War II to identify a nutrient and how much of it was necessary to prevent a deficiency. So at the end of the day, the recommended daily allowances are how much is necessary to prevent a deficiency. It has absolutely nothing to do with optimizing someone's performance. And if 68% of the population is not even meeting the basic bare minimum, athletes aren't even close, because you lose so much of it through sweat. You lose so much of it through just the practice of your sport.
Do you ever take Calm, that magnesium drink?
Well, no.
Dude, it's crazy. It's like lucid dreams, and like I was like, is there acid in this thing? Like, I'm tripping out. It was very odd.
No, it's that's one of the things that usually can mean. I don't want to say usually, but it can mean that, yeah, you might be a little bit deficient in your body. You give that body what it needs, and it's like, oh boy, soaks it up.
Did Ashton ask you about Lactigo?
He did not.
Okay, I figured he might run it by you. So I sent him some. It's a Carnosine product. So basically, instead of having a supplement with beta-alanine, they figured out how to pass it through the skin. First company ever to do it. They're probably I might have to edit this out, because they actually, since the FDA since it hasn't been done before, the FDA is making them prove it in order to put it on their website in wording. So they will talk about it. So basically it soaks up the hydrogen when the lactate is broken down when you're going hard. But for lifting, they've used it in like MMA for years. They're using it in track and field. And I joked with the dude, I'm like, dude, I'm going to take a bath in this. And he's like, yeah, 2016 Olympics basically did that with people. And I was like, are you serious? I guess when they went from wherever it was to Rio, they cut the time in between the heats. So to get it actually, the carnosine in the muscle, you want at least 45 minutes. He's like, athletes were finishing their heat and they'd come over to warm up to warm down. And he's like, I'd actually like be ripping their pants off, lathering them in Lactigo. And I'm like, we just need to throw them in a bath. But it also has magnesium. And my performance in the gym and on the bike, I've only been using this since probably September, like crushing PRs that I'm 39. And
Sure.
they've got some NHL guys that have gotten their hands on it. And one
Okay.
guy
Yeah.
went to their like combine where they have like times and different basically like speed assessments, and they said that he was crushing all the team's times that he was getting drug tested. Like the league was sending people like, dude, you've never posted times like this, something, you're on something. And he's like, yeah, this little can. I'll send you a link on it. It's
Yeah.
super
Please do.
interesting. um
Sure.
but okay, and the other question, what's your thoughts on, everyone always, there's half a camp that takes the multivitamin, the other half that says you just pee it out. Do you think it's
Right.
whatever you hold on to is worth peeing out the rest of it, or you don't think that you pee it out?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the funny thing is the fact that I've got like, it's kind of like anytime that you read kind of the same thing in multiple sources
Mm-hmm.
that, are all reputable, there's probably something to it. And so, for the camp that doesn't take that multivitamin because you just pee it out, I'd rather just pee it out. I'd rather pee it out. Because at the end of the day, it's like, if you're not giving your body what it needs in order to optimize your performance, then, what are you doing? I mean, because that's always the thing. It's like people are looking for like the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, but
Mm-hmm.
they just completely bypass the basics. And it's like when you look at multivitamins, there's a lot of research, there's even some research that suggests the fact that we have up to over 100 times the stress of our grandparents. And it's largely because of just our social constructs and that sort of thing. But if you also consider the fact that they had like, a Great Depression, a Dust Bowl, and a couple of world wars in there, it's kind of a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for those that don't necessarily subscribe to that school of thought, I would suggest then that they do a deeper delve into the research and not just cherry pick things that kind of support whatever it is that they believe. Because at the end of the day, it's like, well, I mean, there's no way around it. I mean, your body needs basic vitamins and minerals in order to operate efficiently. It's also well documented that athletes will lose nutrients at an expedited rate just through the sheer practice of their sport. Those two things are pretty much indisputable, right? And so what I have found, though, I think this sometimes is what may be at the root cause of what drives that kind of idea, and I cannot fault them for it at all. And that is because the supplement industry is heavily unregulated, and there's a lot of less than reputable brands out there that are looking for basically just a way to increase their profit margin. And
Mm-hmm.
so when it comes down to it, like if you're getting multivitamins from Dillon's and Costco and Walmart and that sort of thing, you're getting subpar products, period. Like some of the best brands that are out there, you will not find in health food stores. You will not find in grocery stores. So if you are like
Hit us with
the
some of those.
multivitamin,
What's the brands that you like?
yep, that's where I was going actually. The one that I use is called Designs for Health. They are really great at providing uh, educational materials for both either the practitioner and or the client. So it kind of explains, the reasons as to why. It also provides links to research to kind of if you're interested in reading that sort of thing. I like uh, Designs for Health. I like ATP Labs. I like the Polican Group. Um, let's see. Seems like there's another one that I'm missing, but I can't remember it right off the top of my head.
That's
Um,
all right.
but
You can message
yeah,
me it, and yeah, we'll put it on there. Dude,
sure.
so I got to give this guy the plug. If you're in Kansas and you're not setting up an appointment to go talk to Chris, like I got this guy on for weightlifting, and I'm going to like chew his ear off talking about nutritional stuff. This is incredible, man. With that said, let's jump into the weights portion.
Yeah,
One thing that I thought was interesting that Ashton mentioned, we do periodized training for cycling. We have different build phases, and you're racing, and we rotate
right.
training blocks.
Sure.
I'll be athlete number one that's guilty of, I just lift heavy, and I don't know if you're
Yeah.
familiar with GZCLP. It's linear progression. It's just similar to, I guess, probably like a strong lifts 5x5. It's more of like a 5x3. Tier 1 is your big lift of the day. Then you do like a 3x10 of a tier 2, and then tier 3 is 3x15s. And I do deadlift, squat, and then overhead press. I skip the bench day and just rotate those three. Um,
Mhm.
when he's talking about rotating blocks, what's your theory on how an athlete should be looking at their strength program? And obviously, this is going to be individualized and different for everybody, but for the person listening, where should they start?
That's a very good question. It somewhat depends on what their background with training is.
Mhm.
And so if it's somebody who's relatively new to it, I would suggest then finding somebody who's got the qualifications, et cetera, in order to show you kind of, what the basics are.
Mhm.
But that's where things kind of start to get a little bit fuzzy, is because we're talking about a very specific sport with a very specific set of biomechanical demands, and bioenergetic demands. And so this idea that squat, like in many athletics programs, like this idea that like squat, bench, power clean is all you need. It's like, man, there's more to athletic preparation than just those three lifts.
Yeah.
Um, for example, like there is probably over 180 different ways that you can perform the squat. The trouble is that most people only know two: the front squat and the back squat, right? And so there's lots of different ways to program it. And so if it's, somebody that is a little bit more advanced, then obviously you can get away with using a little bit more advanced methods. But at the end of the day, when if it's a beginner, I'm very much of the opinion that they need to find someone that can show them how to execute the big lifts properly with good technique.
Mhm.
And I think that, from there, it kind of starts to get a little bit more individualized, I suppose. So you can, beginners can make pretty good progress with a very, very simple, very, very basic program. But past that point, you need to get a little bit more deeper into the weeds. So, for example, like the thing that I frequently will tell a lot of the endurance cyclists actually is like the program that took you from pro or from amateur level to pro level is not necessarily going to be the same program that sustains you as a pro. you know and so you kind of get to a point where you need to be a little bit more conscious of working smarter, not necessarily working harder. I'm a big fan of working smarter and harder.
Hmm. What would be some of those things that you've seen with cyclists that have like they've been lifting? Any general trends and tweaks that you have to make? Like I come in and I'm like, hey
Yeah.
man, I'm squatting, I'm deadlifting. So actually, let's do this. So my full picture, not to get a free console, I'm happy to pay for this. I'm doing like squats, deadlifts, overhead press, uh, bent over rows, tons of core,
Mhm.
lunges. Trying to think of my days right now. Goblet squat, farmer carry. Trying to be
Mhm.
varied and not just doing three things. And
Sure.
my goal is overall athlete. I really want to be an
Mhm.
athlete until I'm 70. So
Right.
just
Right.
being strong human being as opposed to, you know, some people ask me questions of like ass to grass or do I squat 90 degrees or da da da. I'm like, and my similar answer is I always tell people, number one, I'm not a strength coach. So if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, you got to talk to somebody that this is their job. I'm trying to get you to want to lift. But I
Mhm.
always say, I'm like, dude, I don't say 180, but I might start saying that. I say there's 100 different ways to squat. Vary it up if you
Sure.
want to. Like just get in the gym and do something safely, and you're going
Mhm.
to get benefit from that. That's my sort of viewpoint. That might be not what you believe in, but what would you say? So I walk in, I'm like, yo, this is my deal.
Yeah.
Um, I'm racing a lot. I'm riding a ton. What kind of comes to your mind when that's the athlete? We were like, okay, I've seen this before.
Sure. So, usually the first thing that I look at is, what are their, to be honest with you, how do they stand? Just at rest, how do they stand? If I
Hmm.
have the opportunity to kind of see someone walk in, or just walk without them knowing that I'm watching them, that can tell me
Hmm.
quite a little bit. But kind of like with the nutritional stuff where you have those four kind of key areas. With
Hmm.
cycling, what I've seen is there's not enough emphasis on hamstring strength, especially as knee flexors. So like leg curl variations, they typically have an anteriorly rotated pelvis because of all of the miles and all the hours in the saddle. And they typically have very weak they usually have very weak scapular stabilizers. So they're usually not very strong through the mid back. and they typically present with a little bit of a anterior rotation of the shoulders, and so their shoulders are kind of rolled forward a little bit. And again, that just has to do with the amount of time spent on the bike. And so that tells me right away that, one of the things that we need to do is improve strength of the hamstrings as knee flexors. We need to work on drawing the hips back into a neutral position, because you want to make sure that the spine is safe when you're squatting and deadlifting. There are a lot of folks that will be somewhat surprised that when I start working with the cyclist kind of right out of the gate, I don't have them squat. I may have them work on a hip hinge or a deadlift variation, but I don't have them squat until I know for sure that they're able to get themselves into a good neutral, get the hips into a neutral position and not be anteriorly rotated, because it just improves or increases stress on the low back, which you typically never want. Because if the nervous system identifies that, hey, the spinal column is somewhat, the structural integrity is somewhat compromised, it will actually start to shut down neural drive or neural input into the primary movers as a way for the body to kind of protect your back, so to say. So you kind of get to a point where it's like, well, that lift you kind of stagnate, you kind of plateau, right? Then I work a lot with opening up the pectoral girdle. So we work on gaining more flexibility in the lat and the subscapularis and the pectoral muscles. Because until we do that, it makes it somewhat difficult sometimes to really target the scapular stabilizers, especially the muscles that kind of attach on the lower part of the shoulder blade that kind of draw the shoulder blades down. Now that's an important thing, because put it this way, the spine and the rib cage kind of tell the shoulder blade where to go, and then the shoulder blade tells the upper arm bone where to go. Okay, so it's a very, I don't want to say complex, but there are, all those muscles that work, all those joints, kind of work in concert in order to produce or resist movement. And if there's a discrepancy somewhere in that what we call kinetic chaining or kinetic sequencing, if there's some sort of a discrepancy in there, it will ultimately usually have a negative impact on how the shoulder works. And so it's usually the end result with that is sometimes one of those injuries where it's like, well, man, there was no trauma. Like, I didn't hurt myself. It just started aching one day, and it's just kind of been there. It doesn't go away, so they're kind of a subtle injury. So we open that up. And then when we open up the pectoral girdle, puts us in a better position now to really target those muscles that stabilize the scapula. Because at the end of the day, if you can't thoroughly stabilize your scapula, again, kind of like what I said with the squat, your body will kind of reach a point where it is, senses the fact that you're out of alignment, so to say, and it will kind of limit how strong you can get in basic pulling and pressing exercises. So those are kind of the key areas that I usually look for, and more often than not, the key areas that we have to start attacking right out of the gate, because you're only as strong as your weakest link. If those are your weak links, it's going to ultimately limit how well you perform in the stuff that you are good at. But as soon as you strengthen and correct those weak links, those are no longer your weak links, and you usually will perform better at the stuff that you were already pretty good at.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So I even hate asking this question then after hearing about like how squatting is not the first thing that people are doing, but this is the question asked all the time. Do I have to squat ass to grass, or since I'm a cyclist, can I go to 90 degrees and just do heavier weight there? I feel like you don't even want to answer that question, but I'm going to make you.
It's okay. So, I'm a big fan of high bar Olympic squats. So getting as deep in the hole as you can get.
Okay.
But here's the caveat. If it's someone who has the flexibility and the bone structure to do so. Mm-hmm. So there's something called a hip scour test. And this test more or less identifies the depth of someone's hip sockets. And so if someone's got fairly shallow hip sockets, they can usually squat ass to the grass with no issues. However, if someone's got very deep hip sockets, they may only be able to squat 2 parallel or, thereabouts, just because they don't have the bone structure. They just don't have that flexibility, in their hips. And so, like with a lot of things in this profession, the answer is it depends, so it depends on what ability it is. Yeah. But with cyclists though, so let's say that it is somebody who doesn't have, any issues. I'm always going to be a fan of high bar Olympic level squats, or Olympic squats, kind of what we refer to them, just because that's how Olympic weightlifters will squat. And that largely has to do with the fact that if you look at the knee angle on the bike, as you're going through your pedal sequence, your pedal cadence, and you notice like what's the steepest angle that the femur and the tibia kind of get into, what's the sharpest angle that they get into, it's typically never going to be the same angle that you would see if someone's squatting ass to grass, right?
Mhm.
So my point there is that being the case, there's going to be certain discrepancies that you see as kind of a result of only, squatting through a limited range of motion. So, I'm a big fan of squatting through a full range of motion most of the year. But then as a major competition rolls around, that's when we start to shorten up the range of motion. So that's when we may do like a top third squat or an inertia squat, or, a banded inertia squat where you're actually having, you're having the bar set on the safety catches, you've got bands attached to it, and then you're having to blast off the start, because there's a little bit more carryover to a standing start with that kind of an exercise than there would be with like, performing a full squat or something like that. Not that full squats aren't beneficial, but when you look at the periodization of it, that's kind of how I go. So all other times of the year when there's no major competitions, I'm a big fan of full range of motion movements. But then as a big competition gets closer, that's when I start to shorten up the range of motion. And the reason for that is if you shorten up the range of motion and train a lift only through the strongest range of motion, right, where you're the strongest, you're going to get think of it as like almost like supercharging the nervous system. So if you can full squat, we'll say 200 pounds, right? But then when we put you in like a half squat or a top third squat, you can squat 300 pounds. Well, that just goes to show that you're going to get higher or better activation out of higher threshold motor units, which then carries over to the bike. And so,
What does that
you
mean?
know,
What's the
yeah, so
implication on
that's
the bike then?
so how much does an average bike weigh, would you say?
We'll say 16 pounds.
16 pounds. Okay. So 16 pounds is a smaller percentage of 300 than it is of 200, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Right. And so what that means is that, you're going to get more carryover because you are now working at a higher intensity zone than you were able to work at if you're squatting through a full range of motion, if that makes sense.
So you're saying that lifting the heavier is better or it's not as good?
No, lifting heavier is absolutely better.
Okay.
Absolutely
So
better.
it's okay if someone's doing the heavier weights more limited range as they get closer to the competition.
The way that I program, 100%.
Okay.
Yes.
So a couple things that jumped out there. You mentioned periodization. So I want to ask you about that, and also link this up with then potentiation, which I had no idea what that was. And Ashton dropped that on me when we were chatting. Let's start with periodization. Is there a general periodization besides the lift full body range of motion movements as you get closer to competition, then focus on the heaviest weight we'll say that you can do? And what would you
Right.
say is close to competition within 2 months, a month, 2 weeks?
Right. So usually the way that I will do it is, it depends again, kind of on the training background of an athlete. And
Mm-hmm.
so, there's kind of traditional linear periodization, that everyone's kind of at least somewhat familiar with. And so, that usually means it's something more along the lines of, for example, like the first phase is 12 to 15 reps. The next phase is like 10 to 12, 8 to 10, 6 to 8. So it's kind of a linear, progression. As someone's training age gets a bit older, I may change things up a little bit. I really like undulating periodization. I usually reserve that more to use kind of in the off season, and that's largely just due to the nature of the sport. And so, as we get closer to competition, I usually will switch back over to more of a linear periodization, and that largely has to do with the fact that training for endurance and training for strength they kind of live on polar ends of the spectrum of the performance spectrum. And so as the mileage picks up, then we don't want to kill them with lots of volume, in the weight room.
Mm-hmm.
So the downside though is that if the more endurance training you do, the less effective, or the less efficient, the weaker you become, put it that way. Right. And so that being said, I really do like the linear periodization as far as a major competition getting closer, because then it allows you to kind of work on getting stronger. And then about 2 weeks or so out from the major competition is when we try to peak you. Right. And so that's when you're going to be trying to lift the most amount of weight, usually almost always through a limited range of motion, depending on the lift. And then, off you go to the track or to the road. Ashton's a big proponent of lifting close to competition. I know that is a no-no as far as a lot of coaches and a lot of cyclists go, and I completely agree with Ashton. In my opinion, if I had the opportunity, every cyclist would, if we're talking about track cycling, every one of them would be in the weight room at least 30 minutes or as close to the competition, the start of competition, as we could. And this is kind of a decent segue, I suppose, to really maximize the potentiation aspect of things. And so we start kind of with high volume in the months leading up to a competition, but then that volume drops and the intensity goes up, and then it just kind of stair steps until, we're lifting, one of my favorite rep schemes for kind of peaking is a 5-4-3-2-1. So it's 5 sets. 5 sets usually, or 5 reps usually represents about 85% of your 1 rep max. And then we kind of stair step it down. And that way, it's kind of a gradual warm up, and then ultimately trying to lift the
Down meaning less reps, but more weight.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. So I got 8 million questions stemming from that. So when someone's warming up for lifting, I've noticed that when I first started lifting, I wanted to always make sure that I was, not jumping into the weight too heavy. Then I start, say I get up to I'm lifting something, doing a deadlift at 300 pounds. If you start at 135, you got a lot of warming up to do to get to 300 if you're only adding 20 pounds at a time. So I kind of was just guesstimating and say, all right, I'll start 155, maybe 185. Do you have a protocol of what someone should do to warm up, or is this by feel? I didn't want it to feel too heavy. And as I got, I would only do when I first started lifting, I think I was doing 10 reps of each weight to warm up. And then I'd get to I'd lift it, but I'm like, man, this is just a lot of that movement. Now I just do 4 or 5 at each weight and, really focus on the form and everything. What's your idea of what should a warm up be to get to 300 pounds?
Yeah.
Which to you might be dude, that is the warm up, but for us baby lifters.
No, sure. No, so it's usually going to be kind of a percentage based or kind of percentage driven, as it were.
Okay.
And so it's 300 pounds is kind of the goal. Then we kind of, what's 65% of that, 75, 85. And depending on how the weight feels, depending on the recovery of the athlete, just kind of go by feel sort of at that point.
Okay.
And so, it's usually, if I'm working with someone in person, it's a lot of the time going to be the speed of the bar on the concentric. So if they're able to still lift fast, then we may go up a little bit more aggressively with their loading. But, if we're working, for example, I mentioned the 5-4-3-2-1 rep scheme. So if that's the scheme that we're going to be using, the warm-up reps may look very similar to that. And so we don't want to go too high with too many reps, because then we're training outside of the zone that we're actually going to be training in. So we want to try to maintain as close to those the reps as we can, and so then I kind of usually will give them a little bit of an idea of where those warm-up numbers should be based on numbers that they've actually done before. So I use an app that kind of tracks all that, and then from there, it's cool because it will give me a
is it Clank?
No, it's called Train Heroic.
Okay.
So it's kind of a multi-use one. A lot of teams use it. Trainers, coaches use it. But actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think Train Heroic is actually owned by the same folks that own Training Peaks. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think that might be the case.
Man, I'll tell you, they do a bad job of advertising it, because I'm on Training Peaks 20 hours a day and I've never seen it. So if it is, I'm going to have to email them and be like, yo, put an ad up.
Well, because I've kind of I had a call with them not too long ago, and kind of made mention of the fact that if you guys are owned by the same folks, it would be great if we could marry those two platforms, because the one thing that you will find, or actually the one thing that you will have no problem finding, is a number of apps that will train the endurance side of performance, right? But there are not very many apps out there that track the strength training side of things. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of going down the rabbit hole here, but I'll kind of give you an idea. So one of the things that I've wanted to do, and this was something that I was kind of pitching to the head coach before COVID, was, if we were able to then, so if all the athletes are using Training Peaks to track their training, then we can export that data. If we're using, Train Heroic for their strength training side of things, then we can export that data. Well, then if we plug in major competitions and we can start layering that stuff over one another, then we can get a better idea of how someone responds to certain kinds of training, and we can better individualize their training program. Because if we're talking about a team of like 5 to 7 guys, that's not that big of an undertaking. It's just the collection of that data first, but that's, for a different topic for a different day.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing that how athletes, especially newer ones to power, since it's been out there for a long time, they think that the Bible has been written on training with power. And I'm like, guys, just remember, I mean, the things that have changed from when I started using power 12 or 13 years ago, 10 years ago, totally different ball game. And they were really guessing then, like, we have ideas of what works and everything, but like, add in strength training. You really need to listen to your body. You need to like use the data. They're great tools, but this is by far not the Bible. And so, yeah, I think having those types of things married together, Ash and I were talking, I'm like, what kind of training stress score do you use? He's like, 75, just seems like a good guess. And because there's, we don't have a power meter when we're lifting. And when I started lifting, I wasn't even counting strength because I was like, well, I don't count every mile that I walk and I don't count, whatever. But I really feel like now that I lift heavy and I feel that neuromuscular like shred or whatever you want to call it at night when it's just like, oh, wow, I'm exhausted. Right. That counts for something. Sort of speaking of stress and strain, as a cyclist or an endurance athlete, you might go through a big week and you might add on hours and you might just for me, partly sometimes I'm just like, I just want to burn a ton of kilojoules these last few days and like go into the rest week. Is there a time where lifting more is a good idea, or is that just setting yourself for injury? And if we could define more, meaning sets or weight, or what does more mean? And I also want to be cognizant, we're at an hour. I'm good if you're good, but if you have to go, let me know whenever closing time is.
Sure. No, I'm actually, my computer is running out of juice here, so I need to get on it. Oh, you're good.
And dude, this is awesome information. Yeah.
Let me get this thing here.
Oh, and one other question before I forget too. I noticed you have online, like if people can't visit you in Kansas, you have you have online plans, correct?
I do. Yes.
Yeah. So people, you guys got to check out his website. Is this type of information included in those plans, or we can chat about it later, or just send me info I can post with this so people can check it out?
Sure.
Sorry, I just asked you like 5 questions at once. Let's start with the big week. Is a big like today. So I'm about to have a rest week coming up. I'm going to go tomorrow. I'm going to do like a 5-hour ride. Today I've only got the gym because it's raining and 35 degrees. Bad idea to lift more, or do you add on a set?
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes that's going to be very dependent on someone's recoverability. And so, the thing with endurance athletes a lot of the time is that they are frequently overtrained. And so, and that's not confined to just today, but like long term, because the thing with stress is the fact that it's cumulative, right? And so if you're not recovered from this workout, we'll say, and then you want to go and you want to put the hammer down, right? But you're not recovered from the workout the day before, you go put the hammer down. Well, now you're not recovered from that workout on the third day. And so it's just like it keeps burying you and putting you further down the recoverability. And so, if there are certain days where you have the opportunity to lift more, I'm always a big fan of that because strength is more of what we call kind of a perishable skill. Unless you practice it and you practice it often, you'll lose it over time. Endurance, however, is not necessarily the same. There's actually some research that suggests that like elite level marathon runners can get away with doing one long run per month and not lose anything as far as their cardiovascular capacity goes. But, one of the things too with endurance athletes is the fact that they are typically very much they're kind of a thyroid driven person. So kind of going back to the ectomorph kind of body type, they're usually thyroid driven. They usually don't do very well with idle time. And they like to be busy. They like to be, doing something that's going to help get them better at what they do. And so what do if their times start to tank a little bit? They ride more. That's actually the opposite of what they should be doing, in my opinion. They should be resting more, or they should be lifting more, or doing something that's going to put them in a position then to optimize their training when they get back, kind of when they get back to it. So I think that, lifting more is usually a good idea. Devoting more time in the off season to lifting, I think, is kind of the way to go. And there definitely should be an off season. Let me refer, because too many times everybody wants to go like all year long. It'll be like, -5 degrees outside and people are still riding, and it's like, that is usually not the best approach. Spend that time in other areas of your performance that will end up making you better, when the season resumes, or when things kind of get back to normal, as it were. So I'm a big fan of, training more, spending more time in the weight room kind of out of season. And then as the seasons get closer, the road mileage picks up, then cut that time in the gym back. And when you cut that time in the gym back, now you're focusing a little bit more on the major, the big primary muscle groups, the big compound lifts. When you are out of season and you have more time to spend in the weight room, that's when you really want to start working on those those discrepancies that you start to see, or those key areas that most cyclists are going to need to work on. Or if there's a certain lift that you need to improve, that's the time to do it, right? Because by the time the season rolls around and you need to be strong, you need to be powerful, like the ship has sailed as far as like trying to, identify and remedy those weak links and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think it's been interesting too with the really huge surge in people doing indoor racing, and it's also, I see a lot with athletes that live in the South where it's never poor weather. I'm okay if somebody rides all year long. It's just you need to really dial back the intensity, and that's one thing.
100%.
I'll do I tell, like, my mentor was very old school, and so it was like, do not sprint and I was in upstate New York, so it was cold and snowy. Do not sprint from November until the middle of January, ever. And I abided by that. And it's still in me a little bit, like, there's a lot of physiological reasons why someone's going to sabotage their endurance workout if they are sprinting, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. But it's also like, just let the body do some recovery. Just go ride, get aerobically fit, go lift in the gym. And there was somebody, to your point of the marathon runners, I think people are surprised. I do a lot of long rides. And so I always, because of things now with social media, I try to tell people, I'm like, don't do it. I'm not riding for getting better at racing. I'm riding for my own personal reasons of, like, I love riding and it's a better option than other things I used to do. But they see mega miles and I'm like, dude, do 2 long rides a month and you will be much better at long events. I don't need you doing 6 hours every day on the weekend. Like, and right now your body might not be able to handle that. Also, on the flip side, somebody was telling me, and tell me what you think of this, that when it comes to lifting heavy, that if you're doing maintenance work, if you can get in the gym twice in a month, they said you can mostly maintain on heavy lifts. So if you get into a part of the season where you got a bunch of races, go in on a Tuesday, do your heavy lift, get to the B race, maybe not lift the week of the A race. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm kind of more in your camp of, like, I keep lifting now. But you can maintain with a couple lifts a month, can't you? If it's a quality.
Yeah, I mean, it's typically about the quality. I mean, if there comes a point where that's the only option that you have, that is better than not lifting at all. But at the same time, you definitely want to maintain quality of effort, maintain quality of work. And so it's not about, like, one thing that I see a lot too sometimes is, like, somebody will be getting into the season, or they have a big race or something like that come up. Well, I'll still go lift, but I'll just lift light. To which I usually say, then don't do a fucking thing. Just don't lift. You're going to lift light, but don't lift, because you're not doing yourself any favors. Recover.
You're working out, you're exercising, you're not making yourself a faster, stronger athlete. Dude, that's awesome to hear. That's very, love it. A few more questions for you. Another very popular question from the cycling community is, deadlifting, straight bar or trap bar?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I typically, so depending on what sport you're looking at, there's something that we sometimes refer to as predictor lifts. And so a predictor lift is a lift that shares a movement pattern that is similar to a movement pattern that is inherent in the sport or the position that someone plays.
Okay.
And so the feedback that I've gotten from the cyclists is that they feel that the trap bar deadlift has a lot more carryover to the bike than a traditional deadlift does. And the other thing that I'll say about that too is I will usually, especially at the beginning, kind of make the trap bar deadlift kind of the first and foremost kind of, deadlift variation that we use. And then I use straight bar variations like Romanian deadlifts and things like that as more of an accessory exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And that is largely due to trying to get their pelvis back into a bit of a neutral position. And so just really trying to, really strengthen that lower back, the glutes and the hamstrings especially. And then as time goes on, if it's someone who can then maintain a neutral hip position, then we can maybe transition to more of traditional style deadlifts. Like one that I really like to use with Ashton, and that one that he likes is it's called a rack pull. So it's just like a partial range of motion deadlift inside of a power rack. He really likes that one.
Man, it's great to hear that, because especially like, all these questions, it comes back to the individual. What's your goal? And I mean, really the answer that I always have in my head is, okay, I switched gyms when I moved out here to this farm, and they have a trap bar. Never had access to one before. So I like it that I can do heavier weight. It feels a little bit safer. It does feel a little bit more bike specific. But then I asked myself, but I kind of was into lifting for not bike specific, but overall athletic human health. So maybe I should have the straight bar as like my T2 lift when I'm deadlifting, do some variation, different stimulus. So it's kind of, it's interesting to hear, you gotta, when an athlete asks this question, it is like, okay, what's the goal? What's the purpose of doing this? Like you really got to think about it. And that's, I mean, I feel like that's been a little bit of a thread through this whole conversation. It's really hard to give these, just broad recommendations. And that's why we're very anti like template training. I usually tell an athlete, like, we don't sell templates because you can find one free online, first off. So don't pay me for that. But secondly, you can learn a lot. And if you don't have the money to pay for a coach, which is cool, like just put some time in and you'll be able to set up your own plan way better than a random thing that has no idea about you. Which is kind of, I think, my very first question. You're like, okay, well, it depends. And here's why. So plateauing in lifting. So a lot of times for cycling, it's you got to change up the stimulus. And I'll see athletes that have plateaued, and it's like, well, dude, you've done the same thing for the past 2 months. No wonder your body's not getting any different stimulus. You're actually just going to get worse at that. What's kind of, and I'll tell you, so through the GZCLP, when you can no longer do 5x3, you go to 6x2, but increase weight. And then it's 10x1, increase weight. When you can't lift that, you rest a couple days and you restart the 5x3 at 85% of your 5-rep max. So I don't know if that is the correct terminology of like a weightlifting plateau, but that was someone's specific question. What does Chris think of, like, what do you do when an athlete's just not getting stronger?
So when it comes to to plateauing, that is just kind of one of the things that goes with the territory, as it were. And so it's going to be more or less about how you apply, kind of like what you were saying. It's going to be kind of about how you apply the stimulus. And so, where I come from anyway, from at least how I program, that usually means that we're going to find where. Like, is it a particular lift that someone is plateauing on? And if that's the case, where are they? Like, where's their sticking point? And once we kind of identify where their sticking point is, then it becomes a lot easier to put together a program that includes variations either of that lift or assistance exercises that are going to help keep them progressing with that lift.
Okay. Yeah. That's one thing too that you know, as a newbie lifter, I consume some stuff on YouTube about it to try and just hear what other people with more experience are doing. And I think it was Alan Thrall. He's big on like these tertiary lifts. And one of his buddies was talking about how, you know, I think it's like the bent over row is going to help your deadlift down the road. And it's not just the deadlift, it's all these other little things you do that will make you stronger. And this dude's huge and ridiculously ripped. And he's like, or maybe it was the high pull. It was something. He's like, no doubt, when I started skipping these, thinking they were BS from so and so, he's like, I stopped making the gains. I went back and did the extra little work, get the extra little 1% here and there. It adds up on itself, and it's very interesting. Just, you know, I think as cyclists too, we don't realize how much goes into lifting weights. It's a sport of its own. So that's why I always tell people, listen, I'm giving you recommendations based off what I know, and I am not a strength coach. So
Sure.
it's a good reminder that if people really want to go all in on when they learn the importance of strength, you know, talking to somebody beyond this podcast is going to be highly valuable for them in developing as a better athlete and cyclist.
Oh, I agree. I mean, that's one of the things that is not always given the kind of attention, again, that I believe that it is, or that it's due. And that is, you know, there are many folks out there that think that, you know, that this is just simply lifting weights. It's picking a barbell up and putting it down. Or there are many people out there who might think that, if you're familiar with like West Side Barbell, you know, they're power lifters, right? Yes, they are exceptionally strong and they're very good at what they do. But at the end of the day, if you have a cyclist whose entire training philosophy is essentially, you know, kind of borrowed from another sport, well, that might not necessarily mean that that's the best approach for them. You know, for that.
Sorry, man. I'm gonna get out of here in a second. I got two last ones for you if you got a minute.
Yeah.
All right. One guy was asking about, excuse me, plyometrics. Do you ever switch off heavyweight and go to plyo or specific speed work? And his specific question was more lifts at cycling speed. So like he said 80 to 120 RPM. I don't know how you would equate that into the weightlifting world, or just plyo in general in weights. Or do you sprinkle it in? What's your kind of thought?
Yeah. So again, it largely depends on where someone is in relation to their season,
Okay.
because the ability to produce power is really just a mathematical equation of strength and speed. That's it. But the problem is too many times people want to work on the speed component and don't spend enough time working on the strength component of it, right? And so when it comes to, you know, plyometrics, I do use them, but I usually will, you know, kind of restrict their use to when a big competition is coming up.
When you say restrict, meaning don't do it close to a competition, or only do it?
No, actually, the opposite.
Okay.
I would do them only in preparation as a big competition gets near. Because with plyometrics, like with anything though, like the one biomotor ability that's almost the most predominant across all sports is the ability to produce power. The problem though is that a lot of athletes and a lot of coaches then want to work on power development all year long. And that really kind of goes against just basic adaptations. So if you're trying to work on power all year long, that usually means that you're detracting from some other area of your performance. And so most of the adaptations that someone gets from a training program occur within, you know, the first several, I don't want to give an exact number, but the first several exposures, before then kind of the law of diminishing return sets in and it becomes less effective. And so the reason that I only use plyometrics and their variations close to a competition is exactly for that reason. We want to use them when they can be the most beneficial, but we don't want to use them for such a long period of time that they start to be less effective. And so we confine them to kind of that initial kind of that transition phase where we're trying to convert all that strength that we've built now into power. And so there's a bit of a conversion phase there where, you know, we kind of wrap up, you know, strength stuff as the primary driver of the training program. And then we kind of transition to where now power is the most, you know, important, but at the same time, we're still working the other side of that equation in the sense that, like, you've used the term tiers, right? So the B tier or the C tier would still be kind of more relative strength work and maybe a little bit of functional hypertrophy, because that's going to be, those strength qualities are fairly close together, that you're not getting too far out of the range, so to say. And
Mhm.
so all of the stimulus is somewhat similar, and there's a little bit of dare I say reciprocal, how do you say that, uh, I don't know, I'm trying to,
Reciprocated?
yeah, a bit,
Reciprocal?
yeah. So yeah, reciprocal in the sense that, uh, the strength will help to, kind of stay with that power, but the power that work that you just did will kind of potentiate the nervous system for the strength work. And so they all kind of live in the same general area, the same general zone, if you will.
Okay. Yeah, man, that's interesting too to hear you talk about how it's that first, six, well, I'll put the number on it, let's say six exercises, then you have the diminishing returns. I had heard someone, I actually think it was Tim Cusick talking, the guy I referenced before, talking about first 6 to 8 workouts is what you get out of, you're going to make your gains through that. I think 8 is really on the far end, because the way I look at it is like Tuesday, Thursday, super hard. Hopefully someone's just doing, if it's in before competitions, endurance miles. Tuesday, Thursday again. Sometimes by the next Tuesday or Thursday, just 5 and 6, they're like, dude, I'm tired. I'm like, that's okay. You just bang, like those 4 midweek ones is where you're getting all the massive intensity. And then the
Right.
volume from the aerobic stuff is what's helping you as an endurance cyclist. And when I have an
Right.
athlete that's always either they don't rest or they're like, I'm not tired, I'm like, that, then you're not going hard enough. We're not pushing it hard enough in
Right.
the hard
Right.
sessions, because you should be. Um, so last question for you, kind of,
Sure.
and I actually don't know this for lifting. Do you guys do rest weeks? Or my question was going to be super cycling specific. When an athlete goes through rest week, obviously, let's say, because it always depends, let's say it's before competitions, they're taking a rest week because they've just trained hard 3 weeks. Do you think they could continue lifting in the gym, or should they cut the gym out also?
No, I'd usually suggest that they continue to lift,
Okay.
but usually what we'll do is cut the volume down, because it is the volume that will wear an athlete out faster than anything else, faster than any other training variable. It's volume, not intensity.
And is volume in your term the weight or the number of reps and sets?
Number of reps and sets.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
So, for example, if it's like if it's a primary lift, so we'll just say it's a trap bar deadlift. Let's say it's 5 sets of 3 is what the protocol is. But then, as if it's a rest week, we may shorten that down to 3 sets of 3.
Okay.
So we're still potentiating the nervous system, keeping it active, but we're not doing enough volume to incur any kind of residual fatigue. It's just to kind of keep that nervous system, keep it active,
Okay. And so then it seems
keep it
like
potent.
and man, I'll ask this in embarrassment, because you might be like, dude, you totally missed one of my points. Is then I feel like we have been talking about when to lift heavy and when to use it in the cycles of training. I don't really feel like light lifting ever came into play. Is lifting light kind of pointless?
It depends, kind of what you mean by lifting light. Um, in certain instances, it can be beneficial. For example, if we're talking about, um, put it this way, the lighter the load is, obviously, the more reps that you can do. And
Yeah.
so if we're talking about a moderately heavy load for someone, of course, that's going to be individualized to the person.
Mhm.
That's going to be better suited for something more of like hypertrophy based kind of training, as opposed to like strength style training.
Mhm.
But if it is, let's say that your deadlift max is, 300 pounds, and you're like, well, I'm going to go to the gym, but I'm only going to deadlift 100 pounds. Well, then there's no sense in doing it. Just
Yeah.
rest. Just don't even bother.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, if it was someone who was, on a 5x3 protocol and they're in a rest week, well, now it might be more of a 3x3 kind of protocol. Just
But
just
keep it
because, like,
heavy. But keep it heavy. Yeah.
keep it heavy,
Yeah.
keep it heavy, keep it heavy. Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's kind of like what we were talking about a bit ago, in the sense that if a bike weighs 16 pounds, and 316 pounds is a smaller percentage of 300 pounds, obviously, right, than 200 pounds or 100 pounds. That's what we want, because at the end of the day, your nervous system is really only going to be as active as like the heaviest thing that it has recently picked up, or the heaviest load that you have recently lifted, if that makes sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
So like guys, coaches, athletes, whatever, that don't want to lift like anywhere near a competition, I mean, it's not like they're not going to get anything out of it, but there's some low hanging fruit there, that if they were to just kind of keep that nervous system potentiated a little bit, there will be a little bit more carryover to the track.
It's awesome, man. This was a wealth of information and will spark a wealth of questions for people. How can people get in touch with you? What's your most preferred way, through like Instagram or email or calling you, or what's a good way if they want to
Sure.
link up with you?
Yeah, Instagram's fine. There's no problem there. And always shoot me an email. My email address is chris@athleticsi.com.
Cool. Chris, man, thank
Cool.
you for going over on the time. This was going to be so beneficial
Bet.
for so many cyclists. We really appreciate it. And hopefully if
My
I
pleasure.
pass through Kansas, I can pit stop by and meet you in person. And if we can ever help you with
Yeah.
something in the cycling world, let us know.
Certainly will, man. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, man. Thanks for doing this on Saturday morning. Hope you have a good rest of the weekend.
Thank you, man. You too. Thanks.
See ya.
All right. Bye-bye.